Thank you. I'm delighted to give the Hayek address. I ran the campaign in the United States to get President George Herbert Walker Bush to give the Presidential Medal of Freedom Award to Friedrich Hayek, and was delighted that that happened in 1992. Friedrich Hayek wrote Road to Serfdom, and describing in 1944 the dangers of and what motivated the growth of government and the dangers there, and say this is 1944 he wrote, this is not just a German problem, this is our problem too, and described a lot of the future. Maggie Thatcher, when she ran for re-election, had the no U-turn symbol. What I'd like to talk about today is how do we get a U-turn on the present road to serfdom. We're presently, the United States, when we were a colony, 1774, we spent 2% per cap of the American colonists' income on taxes. At the time, the nice people of London spent 20% of their income in taxes. Over the last several centuries, things have gotten rougher on both sides of the Atlantic for liberty. The state has grown. The United States, about a third of people's income on average goes to the government, and here it has grown as well. How do we turn this around? How do we get from heading in the wrong direction decade after decade in terms of size and scope of government to moving towards more limited government? In the United States, one of the first things that was important was to get the political parties aligned in a way that made sense. For many years, almost 100 years, we had two parties in the United States, because in Europe, you can get 2% of the vote in some states, in some countries, and decide who the prime minister is and be very important. In the United States, if you get 2% of the vote in an election, you're officially a nut. You may get to be a radio talk show host after the election, but you don't fly in the big airplane and you don't get to be in Congress. So we divvy up into two teams. And for many decades, the two teams were the Republicans and Democrats, completely regional parties. Somebody told you they were Republican. The only thing you knew about them was that they were born north of the Mason-Dixon line. You didn't know if they wanted bigger government or smaller government or just about anything. And on and on and on. You had conservatives who were Democrats and liberals who were Republicans. There were quite a number of little old ladies in Mississippi who agreed with Ronald Reagan on absolutely everything and voted for George McGovern because Sherman had been unpleasant to Atlanta recently. During Reagan's lifetime, we did sort out the two parties. And the Republican Party is a party, and this is important to understanding how we move forward and how we can do better in perhaps other countries as well. The Republican Party today, the Reagan Republican Party, is a collection of people that sat around the table. Everybody's there because on the issue that moves their vote, not every issue, but on the issue that moves their vote, what they want from the government is simply to be left alone. Go around the table. Taxpayers, people who vote on the tax issue, don't want other people taxed. They simply want to see taxes lowered. People concerned about property rights want their property rights respected. The business community, big businesses, small businesses, they're not asking for small business stamps. They're not asking for the government to go kneecap their competitors. They wish to be left alone. Now, there are businesses that want the government to go kneecap their competitors. They bat for the other team. Around the table in the United States, 2 million Americans homeschool their children. It was illegal in all states 25 years ago to homeschool your kid. And yet the movement grew, became important. These are people making tremendous sacrifices on education, and it's a major commitment and a big issue for them. They simply wish to be left alone. They do not knock on your door and tell you that you should be a homeschooler. They simply wish to be left alone. The Second Amendment community, I realize nobody in Europe understands this, but in the United States, the Second Amendment, big issue, gun rights. I serve on the board of directors of the National Rifle Association, and we don't go around urging people to be hunters. We don't require that all fourth grade children be taught books in public school entitled Heather Has Two Hunters. We're simply asking to be left alone with our Second Amendment rights. And then the various communities of faith in the United States for whom the most important thing in their life is to practice their faith and to transmit it to their children, and they're simply asking to be left alone. First choice, when they're designing the Constitution, might have been make everybody be my religion, but because we were diverse enough at that beginning, second choice was everybody gets left alone. And this is an extremely important thing to understand, because sometimes when you hear the discussion in the United States, you'd think the coalition doesn't hold because some of the religious right might want to impose their values on the other. That's why you have to look in political activity at vote-moving issues. The religious right came into being in the 1970s. Why? Because the Carter administration was going after Christian radio stations using the fairness doctrine, saying that you're not presenting equal time for, I'm not quite sure who the other team is on a religious television show, radio show, television show, but they were going after them with that law. And the IRS, once again, was used to go after Christian schools, K through 12. And so these groups organized in self-defense. And that's why people sit at the table reasonably well, and people say, well, aren't they going to have a fight? You've got these guys who go to church and these guys who have jobs, they're going to argue. Well, some people have jobs and go to church, but what's important is that everybody around the table wishes to be left alone on their key issue, and they vote for the same candidate. The candidate says, I can leave your kids alone, your guns alone, your money alone, your property alone, your faith alone, and then the candidate and the party that puts himself in that position can move forward. Doesn't mean everybody in the center-right coalition agrees on everything. They certainly don't. They don't all have tea together. They don't socialize. The guy who wants to make money all day looks across the table at the guy who wants to go to church all day and say, that's not how I spend my time. They both look over at the guy who wants to fondle his guns all day and say, that's not how we spend our time. But it's not necessary that we agree on what we do with liberty. It's simply necessary that we agree on moving towards liberty. And that's how the coalition that starting in 1980, the establishment looked at and said, this will fall apart any moment, because looking at secondary and tertiary issues, you could come up with lots of disagreements and fights. But on a primary vote-moving issue, they're not in conflict. When Hillary Clinton was running for Senate back in 2000, she gave a speech saying, what we progressives need, progressives are what we used to call liberals in the United States until they ran liberal into the ground and they moved over to progressive. What we progressives need is a meeting like Grover runs in Washington, D.C. And I was asked what I thought of that, and I explained how our coalition works. We put 150 people together every week in a room where there's wide disagreements on what's important, except that what's important to each person is that they be free in the zone that's very important to them. And I said, well, how, and the left, the progressives, the left, have tried to put together similar meetings from time to time. Who would sit at Hillary's table recently stolen by Barack Obama? Trial lawyers, labor union bosses, big city political machines, the two wings of the dependency movement, people who are locked into welfare dependency, people who make $90,000 a year, managing the dependency of other people, making sure none of them get jobs and become Republicans. Then we have all the coercive utopians, the people who get government grants to push the rest of us around, the people who mandate cars too small to put your entire family into, the people who designed and mandated the toilets too small to flush completely, the people who insist on those light bulbs that convince you have glaucoma, and on the Sabbath, you have to separate the green glass from the white glass, from the brown glass for the recycling priests. And they have a list of things that you have to do and a list of things you're not allowed to do that is slightly longer and more tedious than Leviticus. It just goes on and on and on. So around the left's table, they can get along with each other as long as there's enough money in the center of the table, as long as taxes are raised and resources are there. Because then they can cheerfully get together in the way they do in the bank robbery movie after the bank robbery. One for you, one for you, one for you. And everybody smiles. But if we do our job correctly, if we say no new taxes and we mean it, and we stop throwing cash into the center of that table, then all our friends on the left begin to look at each other a little bit more like the second to the last scene in those lifeboat movies. Now they're trying to decide who they're going to eat or who they're going to throw overboard. So our job, step one in the fight for liberty, is don't make things worse. Don't throw money into the center of the table. Every time you raise taxes and increase spending, you create and fund more Democratic precinct workers, okay? So don't do that. Don't raise taxes, rule number one. And if you do that, then the other team begins to be cranky, and as they see that pile of money dwindling, they'll start gnawing on the guy sitting next to them. If they can't eat taxpayers, that guy next door will do, and they'll take his. So you want 2 and 4 years from now to face a left that's shorter and fewer in number because they self-select and they knock out people. The left is not made up of friends and allies. The left is made up of competing parasites. So how do we strengthen our team? How do we make more people whose votes and political activities lead towards liberty for everybody? And how do we reduce the number of people who view the state as that mechanism whereby they get their hands on other people's stuff and other people's lives? Step one, I thought, was taxes. So I run Americans for Tax Reform. We have people take a pledge not to raise taxes. The goal of that is to make it difficult, next to impossible, to raise taxes, because then and only then do you have a conversation about reducing spending. You have an opportunity to focus on spending, but not if you raise taxes. Remember in 1982, they convinced Reagan that we'll cut spending $3 if you agree to raise taxes $1, 3-to-1 ratio. And Reagan had faced a Democratic House and a Republican Senate that was pre-Reagan in its thinking, so he was kind of alone. You know, Maggie Thatcher may have been the only Thatcherite at first. Reagan was the only Reaganite in Washington for quite some time. And he took that deal. And at the end of the day, taxes are raised and spending was not reduced. This happened 8 years later to George Herbert Walker Bush. They offered him $2 of imaginary spending cuts for every $1 of tax increase, which I thought was just insulting. I mean, if you're going to cheat somebody, offer him $10 of imaginary spending cuts. The other was just sort of saying, we know you're a cheaper date, and you get 2, imaginary. And the spending didn't get cut, and the taxes did get raised. The other team raises taxes to spend the money. They don't raise taxes for some other purpose. So if you give them the tax increases, they will spend the resources. And so in 2011, when we had the argument between the Republicans in the House and Obama, and they held, and that's when they had fun calling me names, and they didn't raise taxes. We got $2.5 trillion in spending restraint, cuts from projections, over a decade, not a single dollar of tax increase. If you don't let them raise taxes, then and only then can you get focuses on spending restraint. Now, the Tea Party in the United States came about in 2009, and the pledge was a central part of not raising taxes. It was the necessary but not sufficient condition. Second step, stop spending so much money. And the problem, one of the challenges with George W. Bush 43's 8 years as president, was that he was very good on not raising taxes. He sort of watched Dad raise taxes and throw away a perfectly good presidency. Dad had been a great president on many things, managed the collapse of the Soviet Union, kicked Iraq out of Kuwait without getting stuck occupying the place for a decade. He managed very, very well. There was one problem that he had, and that was he raised taxes, and he threw away a perfectly good presidency. And Bush saw that. We use George Herbert Walker Bush, Dad, in the sense that no one's life is a complete waste. Some people serve as bad examples. So when we talk to young up-and-coming politicians, say, don't do that. It doesn't work. And we did get the spending cuts that we wanted in 2011. What changed was the Tea Party movement, which you've heard a lot about, but this was a radical change in American politics. It's completed our circle in terms of who sits around the center-right's leave us alone table. I believed that you could not get the American people to rise up against spend too much. I knew that when they raised taxes, you could get people all riled up and they would vote and defeat people. But the spending was somehow this thing that was positive, and they bought votes, and you had to wait until spend too much became tax too much, and then you had them. Well, in 2009, Obama came in, and within 2.5 months, he'd threatened to spend so much money, the stimulus and so on. The whole point of the stimulus package was to take $800+ billion and throw it in the middle of the taking coalition's table, okay, to keep everybody happy, and to hire more Democratic precinct workers. So this scared Americans, and we had about 1 million Americans went into the streets to demonstrate in between 600 and 800 rallies around the United States on the week of April 15th. And there have been some very good studies about how this affected the voter turnout in places where you actually had rallies, and compared to places where they planned a rally but it rained, so they never had a rally. You could see that we gained between 3 and 6 million voters in 2010 because of increased activism, the idea of showing up, seeing other people, realizing you weren't alone, you weren't crazy, other people saw what you said. This was all part of fighting against spend too much. It wasn't about tax increases. So in 2010, we elected a great number of people just on the spending issue. So now we have a more complete circle of don't raise taxes, focus on reducing spending, as well as all the other liberty issues that people move forward. And the reason why this is particularly important is that it came at the same time that Paul Ryan, who'd run for vice president in 2012, put together the Ryan Plan, which is the U-turn on the road to serfdom. They wrote it down. And I wrote a book in 2007 where the last 2 chapters were the Ryan Plan. Before Ryan wrote it down, I said, here's what the Republicans are going to do, have to do if they're going to turn things around. And the Ryan Plan is tax reform, taking marginal tax rates down to 25%, corporate and individual, going to a territorial tax system so we don't tax expats who live overseas and businesses that are doing business overseas, going to full expensing for business investment, very pro-growth, a lot of simplification in it. But on spending, and a lot of ideas that have been kicked around by free market advocates for a long time. On the spending side, he takes the 185 means-tested welfare programs. Aid to families with dependent children was the famous welfare program, but there are 185 of them, and block grants them out to the states, just as we did in '96 with aid to families with dependent children. Said, no strings, here's the money, you're in charge of it, and 50, or some say 57 states, each looked at this. And we dramatically reduced welfare spending, got a lot of people out of being stuck in welfare, and we moved forward giving states more autonomy. And the Ryan Plan does this for all of the welfare programs. And then it moves the unfunded liabilities, the Ponzi schemes that are Medicare and Social Security and other entitlement programs, and moves them to fully funded, individually controlled, defined contribution plans. And by doing that, instead of a future where if nothing changed, we go from today 22-23% of GDP spent by the federal government up to 40% if we just coast, takes it instead down to about somewhere between 16 and 18% of GDP, depending on how you assume growth would take place. So taking government half of what it would otherwise be, turning a ship around, it takes a long time. I mean, the reforms in this plan take years to kick in, but it saves $6 trillion in the first decade. So it's not back-ended in terms of savings. And the reason why this is important is we have every single Republican in the House and Senate has voted for this plan. And so 1 or 2 people thought it wasn't tough enough. They voted no. But everybody, they've all voted for it, and they got reelected in 2012. So they voted now 3 times for it. There's a depth of understanding within the modern Republican Party of what this does. When I was first speaking with Congressman Ryan about his plan, and he said, I finally gotten it written down. It's the Ryan budget. We're going to go out and build support. I said, well, do you want me to help go get co-sponsors? Because normally somebody has a bill, you write letters to all the Republicans, you call them on the phone, and you can get 100 good conservatives right away. And he said, no, I'm not going to let anyone co-sponsor the Ryan budget plan until I'm convinced they understand it. So that when they talk to the press, they articulate it correctly, they don't imagine what's in it, they don't say things that will come back and hurt the plan, but also so that they can be serious advocates and apostles for the plan. So he did that. And then again this year, I called Congressman Ryan and said, you know, Hernando de Soto would like to come by and visit you on some of the stuff he's doing on property rights in Tunisia and some other countries. Oh, that'd be great. I'm a big fan of his work. Let's get together in 2 months. I said, 2 months? He just needs half an hour. I said, I am meeting with every member of the Republican caucus to walk through this budget, the update of the last one, so that they have a full understanding of what's in the budget, just the changes from sort of last year to this year. That's the depth of knowledge. So when we talk about Republicans taking the Senate and the presidency to go with the House, they will do X. This is not wishful thinking. It's not, gee, well, you know, here's what the Republicans might do if they fell into power, or if the Democrats made mistakes and the Republicans won the election. This is exactly what they do. This is the plan. It's written down. Every member of Congress gets yelled at about it by folks on the left, gets asked about it in the press, and they can competently defend it and articulate it, which I think is extremely important. So that's the national level. That's the future in the United States. We do the U-turn. We're on the road to serfdom. We do the U-turn when we have a Republican majority in the House, a Republican Senate. We just need 51 votes to cut spending. You don't need 60. And a Republican president. Okay? When and how do we do that? This is a map of 25 red states, Republican governor, Republican House and Senate. 25 of them, 165 million Americans live in states with complete Republican control of the state government. This, by the way, is after the 2012 election, where if you read the New York Times, the modern Republican Party ceased to exist. Then there are 13 states where the Democrats have complete control. California, Illinois, Vermont. They have 81 million people. So a quarter of the country lives in Democrat states, half, more than half, in Republican states, and the rest have split governance between the governorship, House, and Senate at state level. These are the people who redistricted Congress in between 2010 and 2012. So every 10 years we redraw the lines, both at the state legislative level and in Congress. So when you look at who controls state legislatures, red and yellow states, Republican legislatures, voted to write the rules for the next 10 years to keep themselves in power. And the blue states did the same thing there. So these colors are going to stick around for 10 years. You've got 25 basically Republican states, 13 Democrat states, and they're moving in dramatically different directions. Just in the last 2 years, you see all the Democrat states raising taxes so as to not have to reform state pensions. And you're seeing Republican states like Utah reform their state pension system, where in Utah, starting a year ago, everybody who's hired as a teacher, a policeman, state worker, county, local government worker will have a 401k, an individual retirement account. Here's your pay. Here's 10% of your pay into your individual savings account, and that's our obligation on your pension. That's your pension, a defined contribution pension. So you don't get to retirement and have the politicians go, oops, we forgot to go steal a bunch of money for your pension, so you're out of luck, or we forgot to go steal a bunch of money for your pension, so we're going to have to go do that. Surprise taxpayers. We end the creation of unfunded liabilities. Other states are following Utah's movement. They were looking at that in Illinois and in California, decided to raise taxes instead of any reforms. What I want to suggest is, in addition in the federal government, so for the next 10 years we have a Republican House, thanks to the marvels of redistricting. And we have a good shot at winning the Senate over the next several election cycles. We have 2 presidential elections, 2016, 2020. I believe that the Republicans will capture the Senate and the presidency either in 2016 or in 20, and if we do that, the Ryan plan gets implemented. We've done the U-turn on the road to serfdom, and we're heading in the right direction. To take that back, the Ds have to take everything and hold it for a while. I think unlikely. Now, what do we do? What do we just sit and wait for these years to come by? No. And that's where the progress at the state level is very important. There's been a lot of discussion about the demographic changes in the United States. And when Democrats talk about demographics, they just mean race and ethnicity. They're not thinking about vote-moving issues. They think everybody should vote based on race and ethnicity, and they want to make the case that therefore they get to run the country moving forward. When Bertolt Brecht, the Bolshevik, was trying to explain what happened in '53 in East Germany when the East German workers were revolting against the Party of the Workers, the communists, he announced that what they needed to do in East Germany was elect a new people. Couldn't be the government's fault. We needed new people. Well, in point of fact, we can elect a new people. And you elect a new people by changing laws to move people from the taking coalition and having their sense of where their interests lie with the takings coalition, to move over to the Leave Us Alone coalition. And where that's happening now and will continue to happen over the next decades to come is it's state laws that change. I'll give you a few examples, starting with the laws that allow homeschooling. There are 2 million parents who homeschool. Those people are solid, pro-freedom, challenging. They don't want the government to... The government offers to help babysit your kids for free for 12 years, and they said, thanks, we'll do it. And not only are they winning all of the spelling bees as a result of this, they're very, very politicized in the movement for liberty. 25 years ago, we were putting people in prison for homeschooling. It was illegal in all the states. It's now been changed. The voucher movement, the school choice movement, we now have in the United States 3 states that have broken out of a few thousand vouchers for people to go to public schools, private schools, charter schools, to give them that choice, to where there are 300,000 people eligible for a $5,500 voucher in Arizona alone, 500,000 in Indiana, 500,000 in Louisiana. So you now have a mass experimentation of parents who, in fact, are handed, here's a $5,500 scholarship for your kid, K through 12, each year. I particularly like Arizona because it's, here's your $5,500. If you only spend $4,000, you put the $1,500 in an education savings account, which you can use in future years and which accumulates and grows as you move forward. Now, a parent with $5,500, where they, per child, where they walk around and say to the school, here's what I'm interested in, and I can stay with you and you get the $5,500 in the public school, or I could go to another public school, or I could go to a charter school, or I could homeschool, and I get to keep the money. Now, all of a sudden, they have the attention of the public school system, as well as the private schools that create them, that exist already, and others that are being created. You have a different human being who carries that kind of power with them, whereas before you go complain to the public school, they tell you to go away. We already have your money, we don't need to talk to you. They consider parents an annoyance if they show up in the public school, not with a voucher. It changes the nature of the person who carries it. The Second Amendment issue, we now have in the United States, we have 4 million members of the NRA, group that I'm on their board of directors. We have about 18 million hunters, but every year there are fewer hunters. It's dropping about 25% each generation as there's just less land near cities for people to do bird hunting. And so that number is going down. However, starting in the 1980s, we began to pass concealed carry, shall issue concealed carry laws, meaning if you are 21 years old and you haven't been convicted of anything recently and you're not crazy, they shall issue you a concealed carry permit to carry a gun, your purse or your car on your person. 40 plus states have shall issue laws. I'm from Massachusetts. We have may issue. If the mayor likes you or the police chief likes you, he may give you one. 40 states, they have to give it to you. 9.3 million Americans have concealed carry permits. That's a different person than the guy who says, gee, if I get in trouble, the nice policeman will come and draw a chalk line around me. That'll be helpful. To, no, I'm in charge of this part of my life. These are different. These are people who view the world differently, and they are not letting anyone take this freedom. So as you figure out how to give people freedom in places they didn't have, on issues that matter, you've now got someone whose vote-moving issue, mother of 4, who's sitting on $20,000 in scholarship money that she controls, is never going to let them take that away. That's not happening. It's a different person as they look at that. The other is government workers. If you're a government worker in the United States for 20 years, you're 30% more likely to be a Democrat. If you make more than $70,000, you're 30% more likely to be a Democrat. Regardless, all other demographics involved. Government work, it doesn't ruin your kid to work at the town pool for a summer, but if you do that sort of thing long enough, it changes people's politics if they go into government work. The good news is, as you have fewer people working for the state, which is why looking at how many people work for the government is important and is a metric that we need to work at. I went and talked to the head of OMB weeks after Bush came in and said, what's the metric you're going to measure for whether whether you're winning or not? Is it spending as percent of GDP? Is it full-time equivalents in the federal government? You know, how many government workers you have? And he said, oh, that's a good idea. We ought to have one of those. The Bush administration never got one of those. Limiting government wasn't on the to-do list. Remember the strategy group they had after the strategy group, but they're making fun of themselves, the strategy group? After they passed one of the comedy shows made that up and they adopted it as the name of their meeting. After the tax cut, which was in June of the first year of the Bush administration, they didn't have a to-do list. They didn't have a to-do list. So as we're working on expanding liberty, we need to have to-do lists. What will we do when crises happen so we can, as Rahm Emanuel says, never let a good crisis go to waste? Every time there's a crisis in the Bush administration, the left came up and said, you got to spend more money, you got to have more regulations. So when Enron went bankrupt, when they flooded in Louisiana, every one of those, the response was more government. None of them did we say, you know, there are a list of things we think the EPA did wrong in Louisiana, let's fix that. The crisis was never a reason for less government or reforming government. It was always an argument for more of same. And I think we learned from the Bush administration that if you don't go in with a plan of what you want to do, which is why the Ryan plan is so important, it's written down, it's internalized. An entire political party has signed on to it. If you don't do that, you just get pushed into bigger government each time. So you can change demographics. When we came up with concealed carry laws, we changed the nature of 9 million people to make them more freedom-loving. Homeschooling and expanded that. 2 million people, this became a vote-moving issue for them. More people, about half of Americans have 401ks, individual retirement accounts, defined contribution pensions. That's a number that's growing. Scott Rasmussen polling, if you live in the United States, you have $5,000 in a personal savings account, retirement savings account. It makes you 18% more Republican and less Democrat on average. All the demographic groups, white, black, old, young, rich, poor, government worker, private sector worker, every group becomes more Republican with share ownership, direct share ownership. There's one group that doesn't get any better with share ownership. They're already fairly Republican, but they don't improve with share ownership. This is women who earn more than $75,000 a year. So if you know any women like that, don't give them any shares of stock. It doesn't do any good at all. However, if you get them a gun, that's pretty useful. And unless it's one of the really cool 50 caliber ones, it's less than the $5,000. So this is one. Why is the Republican solution to every problem education savings accounts, health savings accounts, retirement savings accounts, individual retirement accounts, lifetime savings accounts? Because somebody's figured out that if people are in the stock market and saving for the future and they see this growing over time, why did Bush want? He didn't have enough votes in the Senate to do it, but why was his goal to privatize Social Security so that every 18-year-old would look ahead to have hundreds of thousands of dollars in a bank account, even if they never had a high-paying job, even if they had a low-paying job all through your career? People are going to accumulate wealth, and that's going to change the nature of who they are. So we can create a new electorate. We can change demographics. Not all demographics are gender, race, and ethnicity or religion. In point of fact, the issues I'm talking about are all legislated at the state level, and you're seeing this effort state by state. The Ds are trying to put more people on government payrolls in blue state. We're trying to have fewer people on government payrolls. They're not interested in people with defined contribution pensions. The red states are very interested in that. We've only seen 2 years of 25 states going in one direction, 13 states going in the other. I mean, with this, every red state can, if it wishes, turn itself into Texas or Hong Kong as rapidly as it wants to. Every blue state can turn itself into California or Greece as rapidly as they want to. And they are. The country's moving in two dramatically different ways in such a way that you can see the comparison. Indiana, Illinois. Indiana, red state. Illinois, blue state. Indiana just passed the right-to-work law, which says nobody can be forced to join a union. 22 states have that. It's one of the first heavily industrialized northeastern states that did so. They're cutting taxes. They're doing school choice. Across the border in Illinois, they're raising taxes to not fix the pension problem. They're giving the unions more power rather than less. On that border, how many factories will be built on the western side of that border in the next 20 years? I mean, there's going to be very real consequences to some states doing it right and some states doing it poorly. You may have read in the newspaper that the President Obama has been spending a fair amount of time and has an interest in collecting data on certain individuals throughout the world. In his administration, there's been one effort to stop collecting one piece of information. They actually announced they were going to stop. There was enough of an uproar, and they backed off. And that was the IRS keeps track of how much money everybody makes, and the Census Bureau keeps track of what states, where people move in and between states. And they were calculating every year not only how many people, more than 1 million, have left California in the last 10 years. This is all internal migration. Have left California, how much money they take with them. So when you raise taxes in California and middle-income people flee the state, you can actually calculate how much money moved. When they had a millionaire's tax in Maryland, and the next year they went to count the millionaires, and there were fewer than there were before, you could actually see where people moved to. They weren't interested in having people see those numbers, and they were going to try and stop that. But it is exactly what helps make the case for more liberty as we move forward. When we have this competition, this is federalism, okay? In the United States, in the South, they talk about states' rights. I'm not for states' rights. States don't have rights. States have powers. People have rights, okay? And states' rights was, I can beat up everybody in Alabama and you can't stop me, which is not a particularly useful right for a state to have. Federalism is, we have 50 states, and we want the 50 states to compete to provide the best, most competent government at the lowest cost, to attract people and capital and jobs to stay in their state and move to their state. And we can keep score. Americans love to keep score. We talk about loser states. Nothing bothers governors more than when I refer to loser states. Oh, you're from one of the loser states. That's why you're doing what you're doing. And they're trying to figure out how to tax across state lines on the internet and everything because they want to be able to reach out from loser states and grab hold of some of the citizens who've been fleeing their state and at least get some of their cash back, income, sales, and others. So as we move forward, the other one's union dues. Talk about changing the electorate. Scott Walker, maybe the next president of the United States, Scott Walker of Wisconsin, changed the law and said if you're a government worker, and right now the average teacher making $50,000 a year is paying $1,000 in dues, and they were taking it out of their paycheck before they ever saw their paycheck, that the city, the town, the school district would take the $1,000 out. They changed the law, and Wisconsin said, we're not going to be taking any money out of people's paychecks for union dues, not just for politics, for dues at all. You want $1,000 from your teacher, you go chase after them and grab them and get your $1,000 yourself. What has this done? About a third of the people who used to belong to unions don't anymore. Every third year or so, you have to re-up the union. Unions are disappearing, not rather than being re-upped. There's tens of millions of dollars that coerced unionization used to put $1,000 on somebody's shoulder, and then the unions just took it off each year as they wanted to. Even people who didn't want to were part of the Democratic Party's political machine because the unions were sending their money in automatically. We stopped that in Wisconsin. Other states are looking to do it. They did a change in Alabama, which denies the public sector, the teachers union, $14.5 million every 4-year cycle that they used to get with zero cost of fundraising. Those of you who ever do fundraising, imagine zero fundraising costs. You get $1,000 checks from everybody, and it doesn't cost. You don't have to write them a letter. You don't have to hold an event. You don't have to buy them anything to drink. You just get the 100% resources coming in. So this is a huge, dramatic change, and the fight for liberty in the states is one. There's a self-consciousness of the Leave Us Alone coalition, and it's why people understand who's in the coalition and why. We step on other people's feet less often because we keep track of the fact of why people are in the room. We understand what motivates the other team, and we have a list of things to do to have fewer of them. And if we can get them to join our team, join the private sector, get a pension, get a concealed carry permit, join our team, we can make more of us and fewer of them as through state legislation. And as this moves forward, we will strengthen state by state on the liberty front and help at the federal level as well. So that's why I see the forces of liberty, while pushed back. A lot of money was wasted. A lot of damage has been done over the last 12 years. It's not just Obama stuff. The Bush people were spending too much and not focused on maximizing liberty as they could. But whatever problems Bush had, they weren't on purpose. Like the guy who starts a fire by mistake. The arsonist is more dangerous. He's doing it on purpose. The incompetent fireman and the dangerous arsonist. That's the challenge we have there. I think we will make the U-turn on the road to liberty in the states, and that's the project that we're embarking on. I recommend the idea of both competition between states in, say, the European Union or something like that, to reward liberty and movements towards liberty and punish states that want to behave like Greece rather than subsidize states that want to behave like Greece. And following this model and moving forward, I think that Hayek's vision of the road to serfdom was accurate. All the pressures he talked about, all the things that made that happen, but we do have the opportunity to do a U-turn on the road to serfdom and move back in the correct direction. Thank you very much.